And so today we will wrap up. You heard about simple model, nonlinear model, CO2 modeling, as well as atmospheric and oceanic. So today we want to have an overview of the how good the models are and what are the limitations. So I would say this is the primary purpose of the workshop. That is for you to appreciate what are the strengths and limitations of any model you use. I believe that most of you in your career will be using various kind of models, not just climate models, many models, because today with the availability of high-speed computing almost at your fingertip, there will be opportunity to use many models. And the main, I would say, your ability you have to gain is to decide whether that model is appropriate for your application, what are the limitations of the model, under what conditions you cannot use the model, and what are the strengths of the model. So this is a capability you have to develop continuously whenever you have to use any model, is to ask the question, is that model appropriate to my application, and what are the special things about the model in comparison to other models. Because very soon we'll have all kinds of models available, and in the next 10 years you will see the exponential growth in artificial intelligence and machine learning. And those are even more complex than what we talked about here. They are black boxes. You don't know much about what it is doing inside, but you have to somehow make a judgment how good those models are for your application. You have to learn various ways to deal with the black box and essentially do various things to the black box to understand its limitations. Okay, so this is thing all of you have to learn, because this is going to be part of your career. Okay? So keep that in mind, that it is what we are talking about is climate model, but the basic philosophy that we are trying to talk about is valid for all models. Any model you use, but ask this question, is the model appropriate for my situation and whether it has this advantage for my application. Okay. So, okay, can you see my screen? Is it visible, my slide?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now I want to start with a quote from Sir Brian Hoskins, who came to our institute some years ago, and he made a very nice statement. Because many of us, both in our center here as well as other centers, we work on models. So when you work on models for a long time, you become a bit critical of it. Okay. Today we'll see, I'll point out various weaknesses in the models in their ability to simulate monsoon. Okay. But those who don't know much about models have two extreme views. Either they accept it totally because they think that this model has done complex calculation, it looks very sophisticated, so it must be good, or you are skeptical, you reject it totally. You say all models are bad. Now, both are not good. You have to realize that models have limitations, but models also give you an opportunity to look at complex systems and evaluate how something will happen. So you have to be alert. You cannot take an extreme view on models. Now, you can see that building and implementing conceptual models for those processes that cannot be expressed explicitly, that is in the case of our example was essentially clouds. That is because spatial and temporal scales in which they occur were not resolved by our models. So those are the ones which are called parameterizations. Okay, and so these are developed independent of the model, and then they are put into the model. Okay. So owing to uncertainties in the model formulation, the initial state, any individual simulation represents only one of the possible pathways. You must remember that when you run a model, get an output, that is not the truth. That is one of the realizations of the truth. And if you want to know what the truth is, you have to run it many times and take an average. Okay? So that's why ensemble is very popular now, because the computer gives you the opportunity to run the model many times. Okay? And when you run many times, your limitations come out clearly, because the model gives a different answer each time. And by looking at the spread of that various results, you get an idea how confident you are of your prediction. For example, when they do weather forecasting these days, they run the model many times, maybe 40, 50 times. And if the 50 simulations give a large spread in the prediction of rainfall, then the forecaster will be very cautious about the forecast he makes. On the other hand, if the 50 simulations all give results very close to each other, then he has great confidence. So this is very important part of ensemble forecasting, that the spread in the result gives you an insight about how good your forecast is. Now, we talked about this in the first lecture I gave. I'm going to repeat that. Every model has many parameters which are not known. Okay, and I want to repeat that point to all of you. For example, ice fall speed. Now, ice particles fall through the atmosphere, and those of you who have gone through high school physics, you may think that very simple. You heard of Stokes' law for the fall of an object, but that's not valid for atmosphere. Atmospheric flow is turbulent. Okay, Stokes' law was derived for laminar flow, very simple case, in a viscous fluid. But atmosphere is turbulent, so the fall speed of ice particle will depend on many things, including the particle shape, size, orientation, and so on. Okay? So that's a big unknown, and there are not many measurements in the actual world about the fall velocities. Okay, so that's a thing we try to adjust in the model. Same thing about relative humidity, at which rain actually starts. That also is really not known well, so you put some number and see what to do. And after a cloud is formed, when does the cloud become rain? This is called conversion rate. It is very important quantity. That also is not well known. So all these are numbers which you have to adjust in a model. And you can see that in cloud itself there are, in this example, 4, and in convection, that is vertical motion, there are about 4. In radiation part, there are 3. Okay, and then in the boundary layer near the ground, there are various unknowns in turbulent flow. Then there are concerns about how it diffuses, and there's something called gravity wave drag. These gravity waves occur especially near mountains, and they cause additional drag that has to be adjusted. So, and then you go to land processes, you have to know the depth of the root, what is the roughness of the forest, and what is the connection between the canopy, that is the leaves, and the evaporation, and so on. And in the leaf, you know that amount of opening the leaf depends on carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. As the atmosphere has more carbon dioxide, the leaf will not open so much because it has enough CO2 to take care of for photosynthesis. So all these are parameters. You can see that there are many of them. And when you build a model, you have to fix all these constants. Question is, how do you fix it? And this is called tuning. This is a very big exercise. It is not talked about a lot. Many people don't know about it. Every important weather and climate center in the world, after they put together a model, atmosphere, ocean, land, everything, they spend a few months tuning the model because there are so many things they don't know. All of them have to be adjusted, and they are adjusted so that, for example, the global mean temperature comes close to 15 degrees centigrade. Okay, and the global mean outgoing long-wave radiation comes close to 240. And the global mean absorbed solar radiation also comes close to 240. All that you have to adjust. And if you don't adjust them properly, there is an imbalance at the top of the atmosphere. That is, let's say your absorbed solar is 240, but emitted long wave is 238. And because of the 2 watt per meter square imbalance, the coupled ocean atmosphere system will not reach a steady state. Okay, you can run it for hundreds of years, it will refuse to reach steady state. Now that's a big headache because you are consuming computer time and the model is not reaching steady state. Now about 20-30 years ago, when Professor Manabe, this year's Nobel Prize winner, was struggling with this problem, he decided to what is called flux correction. When the ocean temperature did not stabilize, he realized that the fluxes transferring energy and moisture between the ocean and the atmosphere, they were not correct. But 20-30 years ago, there had no way to know what the correct value was. So he did something called flux correction. In flux correction, you go on adjusting the fluxes that the model produces so that it reaches a steady state. Okay. So this is completely arbitrary, completely what you might call empirical. There is no logic behind it. It's just you're doing it because you want the model to reach steady state. Okay. Now people don't do that because in the last 30 years there has been a great improvement of our understanding of the ocean atmospheric coupling, so that now the fluxes are coming out just right, so that the model reaches the steady state without any adjustment. Okay, this is called flux adjustment or flux correction, and this was a problem for a long time. Okay. Now here is a nice paper. I have actually taken a few pages from this paper. I want to, most of you can download it. It's available, I think, in Bulletin of Atmospheric, Bulletin of American Meteorological Society, BAMS. It's called the Art and Science of Climate Model Tuning. So I want you to look at the title. It is not just science, it's art. There is a certain amount of intuition involved here, certain amount of luck involved here. And so all these people who have spent their entire life doing tuning, they got together and wrote a paper. Okay. So I can't go through all of that, but I strongly recommend those of you interested in modeling to look into the paper in which they are given detailed examples. For example, they have said that tuning a model to improve intraseasonal variation of rainfall, which is very important for most of us, comes at the cost of increased bias in the mean state. That is, you try to adjust the model so that it correctly reproduces the day-to-day variation of rainfall over India. When you do that, the mean rainfall of the model does not come out right. You would like both the mean and the intraseasonal to be correct, but you don't have enough freedom here to adjust both. So when you try to get one, something else goes wrong. So this is a very common problem. As a matter of fact, now there are 30, 40 weather and climate forecast centers in the world, and you will see that each center will tune the model to suit their area. You look at a Japanese model, they will tune the model to do well over Japan. You look at an American model, they will tune it to do well over America. And so when India borrowed the American model some years ago, they had to do further tuning to make it suitable for India. So that has to be done because the model has lots of degrees of freedom which are not constrained. I hope all of you understood this. This is a very important aspect of climate modeling. Just to show an example, here's an example in three models here, in which they adjusted the fall velocity of ice. Okay, it's a parameter. And in order to get the outgoing long wave radiation to come to around 240. Okay. So you can see that in the IPSL model, one version, it happens at around 0.5. Okay. While if you look at another version of IPSL model, which is the French model, it occurs at 1.4. Okay. And the GFDL model, that's the one which Manabe worked on. This is for OLR. So both OLR and absorbed solar have to come in this range. So GFDL gets it at about 1.5, the OLR. Okay. So that is how it is done. Okay, this tuning. Is that clear? Anybody has a question on this?
Sir, so tuning is done for each parameters individually.
No, tuning is done for a certain important quantities which you want to come within the correct value. For example, the global mean temperature, the global mean outgoing radiation, the global mean absorbed. So each group chooses a set of important things which they feel should come out correct. So it depends on application. Okay. For example, if you are looking at the Indian monsoon, you may not care too much about global mean temperature. Maybe that's all right. It may be 16, 17, 18. I don't care. I want the mean rainfall due to September to be close to the observed. Okay, can take that view. So each climate center does its tuning depending on their priorities. Okay, so there is no law or rule here. You decide that this is what is important for the model to get it right, and so I will tune it till this number comes close to this value. So as you can see, yes.
These are not universal. Depending upon the problem in hand, they have to tune the parameters.
Yes. There is no universal. For example, I would be interested in global mean temperature, global mean OLR, and absorbed solar. But if you are only interested in local forecast, local conditions, you don't care for global mean, right? Because let me explain. If you want to get the global mean right, you have to get almost everything right. The polar ice, the Antarctic ice, and something happening in Russia, all that you have to get right to get the global mean right. But if you are primarily focused on India, you may say, well, why should I worry about that? Maybe there's some problem in the ice physics in the model, and it's creating problem in the polar region. Ice is not that critical to tropics, right? Ice particles are important in the upper atmosphere, but ice amount in Himalayas may not be that critical. So one has to choose which you have to use your experience. That's an art. You have to use your experience to decide which tuning for which variable will help you to get better forecasts. Okay, so it also depends on, are you doing short-term forecast, are you doing seasonal forecast, or are you trying to predict climate change? For example, those who are interested in doing climate change, what will happen in the year 2100? They have to correctly tune the global mean temperature and the absorbed solar overlay. They have to do it because you're concerned about long-term issues. But if you're concerned about short-term forecast, it doesn't matter if there is a lack of balance between absorbed and emitted radiation, because over integration over, let's say, 150 days, it won't really matter. So it is highly, that's why different centers have different tuning things. They tune different things for different purposes. Okay. No, tuning, somebody asked, tuning is not changing the equation. Tuning is adjusting certain parameters which are empirical. Okay. For example, in tuning, you don't change the incoming solar radiation. Okay, that you keep fixed. But I must tell you an interesting story. Professor Manabe, in the very early days when he did his research, 1960s, he had a problem. There was too much ice and snow in the model. So as a temporary solution, he increased the incoming radiation. Okay. Today, if you do that, you will be laughed at. But at that time, you will, at that time, it was acceptable because the properties of ice and snow were not clearly, understood or clearly known. So the model did some crazy things. So they increased the solar constant to get the model to get the right thing. But as we improve the model, many of these things are not done. Today, nobody will touch the solar constant. That is given, that is measured. You have to put it right. Okay. Now, somebody asked, how can we define optimal number of ensemble members? Answer is, you don't know. You ask anybody in the forecast and prediction in a system, they will tell you, I want many more. But remember, ultimately, the limitation is computer time. For example, I would like our weather forecast center to do 100 ensemble members. So then you get a nice spread and you'll know what are the problems. But they cannot afford it because in a forecast situation, I have to run the program and suppose I want to make a forecast for tomorrow. I have to complete the run by today evening to give forecast for tomorrow. So I have a time limitation. So if I don't have enough computer time to run 100 and some numbers, I'll run only 50. So this limitation is there purely from computer and time available. So in weather forecasting, time is a critical parameter. If I do 100 and some numbers, it'll take me 3 days. It's no use to anyone, right? So this are the constraints on which all forecasting and other centers. So there's no optimal number, more the better. I would say larger the merrier. You get more information. As a matter of fact, a lot of you can learn a lot about the model's weaknesses and drawbacks by just looking at the spread of the ensemble members. If there are some extreme values, that tells you that model has some problem. So if model has a lot of spread, it tells you that the model has some singularities, some instabilities, which is causing the model to go far away. Okay, so the ensemble spread is a very important feedback to the modeler as to what is good and what is bad about the model. Okay, for example, on certain days, ensemble members come close together. On some of the days, they go very far apart. Okay, because in certain days, the model's what you call evolution is very stable. It will go to a certain final state irrespective of whatever you give in its condition. But on certain days, the model is very, very sensitive. For example, I showed you that tipping point. The tipping point, if your model is at top of the tipping point, slight changes in the condition will tip it one side or the other. While at the bottom of that valley, it is very stable, doesn't matter. So these things keep changing day to day. So you talk to any weather forecasting, people will tell you on certain days they have got very good forecast with all the members coming together, and so they'll make a very confident forecast. But on certain days they are not so sure, so they will make a vague forecast. So some of you must have noticed, you go look up the forecast done by Indian Met Department. On certain days, the forecast is suitably vague. They may say it will rain here and there. Now you might laugh at it, but reality is the forecast was not that reliable on that day. Okay. Now here is an example of how sensitive the model is in predicting the temperature at the height of 2 meters for small changes in aerosol configuration. So this is a model run by Hadley Center, and they slightly change the aerosol, how the aerosol interacts with cloud. Okay, cloud has interaction, which is the most difficult part of the model, and they get, instead of this is departure from the present climate, instead of getting around 0 here, for example, they are getting negative values. Look at the pink line here. So it goes negative. So this is the problem with the model. And also notice that when they integrate starting from 1860, for about 40 years, everything is, all the ensemble members are sort of together. Okay. Then, sorry, observation is these lots of black lines here. And these three are three simulations. Okay. And I'm sorry, observation, the black line, I'm sorry, observation black, gray are the ensemble members, and red, green, and pink are the ensemble mean. Okay, ensemble mean, and the spread of the ensemble is shown by gray lines. And what I want you to notice is that from 1860 up to 1900, the ensemble mean is within the spread of the members. Okay, and then it starts deviating. By the way, this ensemble members are only shown for CM3W, only that simulation. That is, there's not enough, they can't put all the members here, too messy, they're shown in one case. So the other two things go outside the ensemble spread of the red simulation. Okay. So this is how sensitive the model is. So yeah, I want you to read this Sandivania sentence. The fact that some models are explicitly or implicitly tuned to better match the 20th century bombing, while others may not be, complicates interpretation of the results in these models. Okay. So, and he said diversity of approaches is unavoidable. Each person does it in a different way. So each model center seek specific scientific goals. Okay, so that's what the problem is. Any question?
Sir, I wish to ask
Yes,
one question. Sir,
sure.
actually, my question is in continuation with your ensembles thing. So somehow ensemble members are means related with the degree of freedom of the system,
Yes,
which is
yes,
very high in the high dimensional system like climate models.
right.
So once we are perturbing some parameter, so how we can ensure that the perturbation in this particular fixed parameter is giving the good ensemble distribution.
That's only by experience. Let me tell you, when you generate ensemble members, you either do it by perturbing the initial condition, because there's some error in the measurement. Let's say you put in temperature in Bangalore at 8 a.m. today, and that measurement has an error of, let's say, 0.5 degree. So you can perturb that by 0.5 degree, that temperature. Okay, but there are people who also do ensemble variation by perturbing the parameter. Suppose you have 10 parameters you have tuned, which are not known exactly. You can perturb it slightly and see what happens. So people do various things. There is no what you call guideline for it. Some people perturb the initial condition. Some people perturb the parameters or boundary condition. Okay.
Yes.
So there are no fixed. You have to do, that's why this becomes an art. You talk to various people. They say my experience shows that perturbing the initial condition is better. And again, depends on where you are. Suppose you're in India, I would say perturbing the humidity will be the most important, because humidity is the most important parameter in a monsoon system, because humidity controls the stability of the air parcel rising from the ground. So if you have any error in humidity, it will cause huge differences in the simulation. So if I'm in India, I know humidity measurements have errors more compared to temperature, so I'll perturb humidity more. But if you are sitting in Moscow, humidity may not matter that much. So this is not science, this is art. So some aspect of this kind of thing is only learned on the job. You go there, you join that forecast center, and over years you learn from the seniors how things are done. Okay, and these are not documented. Unfortunately, we don't have enough documentation of how they did it, except by talking to people personally.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me continue. Now comes the whole set of models that have been used over the last 50 years. Various circles are shown here. The inner one are the ones most commonly used in IPCC simulations. And there are various other options, and then there are various others here. All I want to tell you is that not all models are done for the purposes of forecasting tomorrow's weather or to know what climate is in 2100. Okay, that is an important task. But people also do models, simulation to understand. Okay, you must remember that this is the biggest challenge that is there today. That on the one hand, you have the task to forecast weather accurately tomorrow, day after, and so on. Others have the task of predicting climate change in the next 100 years. But as they are doing that, there are people who have to closely look at the model and make sure the model is behaving properly according to our understanding of physics. So that's why you will see, for example, there's one set of people who have done abrupt change. You suddenly change CO2 by 4 times, give the model a kick. Okay. Now, why do they do that? Because that teaches you many things about the way the model behaves. Okay. So this is not realistic at all. Carbon dioxide is increasing slowly in the atmosphere at the rate of 2 to 3 ppm per year. So why would I give a kick? I give a kick because when I give a kick, the response of the system tells me about the system. I don't know how many of you seen that being done. There are people who test various other things, not computers, cars, or things, by doing various perturbation to the system. So this is like that. So abrupt CO2 change, or for example, going to past climate. The mid-Holocene is the climate 10,000 years ago. LGM is the last glacial maximum. these are extreme situations. Now, we do that only to understand the model better. So my confidence of the model goes up if the model correctly predicted the last glacial maximum about which you have some good data today. Then I have the confidence that this model is not only good to get today's climate, it's also good to predict the past climate, and hence I hope it can predict future climate correctly. So this is how you test a model with various situations. Now remember, the way you test a model is similar to way you try to understand other human beings. You meet a person sometime and you want to become friend with him, then you do various things to find out what kind of person is he, how does he behave, is he honest, and so on. And only after doing some tests, then you start being close to him. So model is like that. You have to do lots of tests, artificial tests, to ensure that the model's physics under various extreme conditions are behaving according to your understanding of how the system should behave. Okay. So, for example, somebody asked, I think on Tuesday, Wednesday, about there are well-known aquaplaning models in which Earth is completely ocean. Okay, we have done a lot of that. Why is that? Because once you remove land and mountains, the problem becomes simpler. So when you put an aquaplaning model with a specified sea surface temperature, then you can understand the way atmosphere behaves very precisely, because all boundary conditions are uniform and given. So for a doctoral work, that kind of work is very nice because you have simplified the problem to its bare essentials. And if that you can understand that well, then you are ready to put on land and mountains slowly. Otherwise, in a real model, you don't know whether monsoon is not correctly due to Himalayas not being properly represented, or Western Ghats, or some other complications. So that's why models are tested under extreme cases like all ocean Earth, all land Earth, no mountain case. For example, one of my students who taught you, Arindam, for his doctoral thesis, he looked at what will happen if Tibet is removed. Okay, because for a long time people believed Tibet is very important for Indian monsoon. He showed that Tibet is not important, which was a great surprise. People didn't believe it. We had great difficulty getting the work published, but finally, after 20 years now, everyone accepts that Indian monsoon is influenced not by Tibet, but by the mountains to the west of 80 East. That is, mountains in Kashmir, Afghanistan, Pakistan. Those are the ones which influence monsoon because they prevent cold, dry air from coming into India from mid-latitude. Okay, so these kinds of unusual simulations are done because it improves our understanding of the model, because the full model is too complicated to fully understand in one go. Okay. So in the last 20 years, huge number of projects have been undertaken by scientists all over the world. One was called AMIP, Atmosphere Model Interconnection Project, which only dealt with atmosphere. They specified the sea surface temperature everywhere for about 10 years, this period when good satellite data was available. And they asked people from various parts of the world to simulate the climate for 10 years. And then they compared all the models and found out which model is better, why it's better, and so on. Then as the computer power became better and better, the next phase was the 10 years later almost, is the coupled model where both across the ocean were coupled and they increase CO2 at the rate of 1% per year. Okay, and all of them did the same thing, exactly same way of increasing, and then we compared all the models. So this has become standard practice of about 20 to 40 groups getting together, agreeing on a common set of initial and boundary condition and time evolution, and looking at the results. Okay. Here's an example that is shown. I have shown it in the first time I'm repeating it now. Here's an example of many models simulating the temperature of the Earth global mean for 100 years. Okay. Now, what you're saying is each of the yellow line is one simulation of one model. Okay. and the red is the multi-model mean. All the models put together, the mean value, and the observation is black. So what do we find? We find that most models are too cold compared to observation. One or two models are too warm by a degree, but most models are too cold. Okay, so that means their albedo is too high for whatever reason. Maybe cloud, maybe ice, maybe snow. We don't know. Okay, and even if we average over all the models, because most models are too cold, the mean is about 1 degree lower than observed. Okay. Now, this is not a good news. If your global mean temperature is 1 degree lower than the observed, then your global mean water vapor will be lower. So that will affect the way the model rainfall will evolve. So I would say that this slightly old paper, 10 years old. I know by now models are coming closer to observation, much more closer. Okay, this is slightly old result. Now, other example, very important for all of you to know, is the annual mean temperature averaged over about 25 years compared to observation globally. Okay, multi-model mean bias. So even if we average all these models, you find the models at temperatures too high along the coast of South America and Africa. Okay, and we know the reason why, because these models we run, the resolution is not very high, maybe 50 kilometers or maybe 100 kilometers. So what happens is, close to the coast of Africa and South America, there is what is called upwelling. Okay? Yesterday, Professor Vanham may have talked about it. The cold water from the ocean rises in a thin layer about a few kilometers wide near the coast. Okay, if your model resolution is 100 kilometers, you cannot simulate the upwelling correctly. You won't get it. So that part of the ocean will be, air will be too warm because the ocean did not bring cold water up. So this is a very serious problem in ocean models, and it cannot be fixed until we get ocean model with resolution of around 10 kilometers. This problem cannot be fixed. This problem we have to accept. So locally it will affect the weather and the climate locally, but globally it may not. Look at this model. It is too cold in the polar region by about 5 degrees. Why? Because the ice and snow in the model is not right. That's what it looks. Okay. For India, it's not bad. It's about 1 degree, which is not a bad approximation. Let's look at the rainfall. Rainfall is very, very serious problem. This is annual mean. Annual mean rainfall over 25 years compared to observation. Multi-model, so no one model is taken, all models are averaged. You find that over our region, there is too high a rainfall over the coast of Africa, too high a rainfall in Indonesia, and because of that, there is too low rainfall over India. India is dry compared to observation. Okay, so if your rainfall over ocean is above observation, somewhere it has to be below. There has to be compensation ultimately. So in this multi-model mean, you can see that all along the tropics, the rainfall is too high, all along the tropics. Okay, and because of that, rainfall over India, over South America is below average. Okay, so I want you to remember that if a model does not get rainfall over India right, it's not because it is not getting the other thing over India right. There is some mistake somewhere else which is affecting India. Okay, this is called the remote response. Something is going around somewhere else and that is affecting your rainfall. Why? Because rainfall is too high over East Africa and Indonesia. There is more air rising there. That rising air has to sink somewhere by mass conservation. So it will sink over India. Okay. So if there is too much rain in the equator, there will be less rain in India. Okay. That is the message. I hope all of you understood that. Now let's look at a lot of clouds. Cloud is very important in all these models. So you always calculate what is the net effect of clouds on the radiation budget at the top of the atmosphere, okay? And you see that the model radio effect minus observation. This is observation by MODIS satellite. You can see that there is a huge error in the polar region, especially Antarctica. Okay? Errors of the order of 5 watts per meter squared. Again, coast of South America, because of that temperature bias, there is a cloud bias also. That is not surprising. Same thing in Africa. So wherever surface temperature bias is there, it will cause cloud bias also. Okay. Okay. So you can see that even after averaging over 20-30 models, there is bias. That means you can't blame any one country, one model for a poor forecast. As a group, they are not able to improve the forecast beyond a certain limit. Okay. Now, this led to a lot of controversy a couple of years ago. Now, this is an interesting plot showing the model predicted warming, okay, in degrees centigrade per decade, distribution over different models. This is the black line is the distribution, or you can look at the bars here that shows what are the models predicting as the warming. So it's anywhere between 0.1 to 0.4 degree. But it is all higher than the observation which is here. This is observation, okay. So in the period 1998 to 2012, the model predicted warming higher than observed. And this caused a major political problem because all the people said your models are all wrong. So global warming will not happen. So let's not waste time in trying to control CO2 emission. Okay. But in the period 1984-1998, this is 15 years here, the models actually predicted less warming than observation. Okay. In the last 50 years, the model is getting it right. So you see the complication. What's happening is in the real world, due to exchange of heat between ocean and atmosphere, natural changes in the exchange, the world can either warm slowly or warm rapidly. Okay? It will happen from decade to decade, it will change. Your model is not able to capture that part correctly. But when you look at over the last 50 years, it has improved a lot because we have more satellite data and better models now, better observation. So I would say this is the most reliable prediction. These two may be partly due to, for example, this period, it could be due to lack of enough satellite data because satellite had just started coming in the 70s and 80s. Now we have lots of data of satellite and which models also use it. So the observation and models are agreeing quite well. So is that clear? This is a very important issue that earlier period before 1990, I would say over a certain short period of here, about 14 years here and 15 years here, there was some problem, but over the entire period from 50 to 2012, the agreement is okay, but in a given decade, it can still go wrong. Okay, now here's a graph showing in a model the trend, that is warming in degree centigrade per decade in the tropical low troposphere, that is 30 south, 30 north in the troposphere, compared to amount of water vapor in that column. Okay. They are closely related. So it's very important to get temperature right because that also controls water vapor. Remember, all models agree on that. That's a very nice result. Every model says that if the warming in the troposphere is more, the water vapor also increase more. And at the rate of around 5.7% per degree centigrade. Now comes to an important issue in this model, which is the way Arctic sea ice is melting. We have very good data from 1979 to today from satellite about the rate at which Arctic sea ice is melting. Okay, that is the black line. Okay, that is the NASA satellite. Before that, it's the National Snow and Ice Center in USA. That is the dotted line. But once satellite came, they were far superior in getting sea ice correct. Now notice that the two coupled models, the old one, CMIP 3, the new one, CMIP 5, especially the old one was not showing melting at a fast rate compared to observation. So this again caused a lot of controversy. People said your model is useless. It is melting too slowly while observation is going rapidly. But fortunately, the more recent version is correctly predicting the ice melt in the Arctic. Okay. Now this is very important because many believe that in the next 30 to 40 years, the entire sea ice in the Arctic will disappear because of global warming. Here is a prediction from various models. When all the sea ice will disappear, you can see they are saying not in this century but next century. Okay? So you may be happy that okay, at least till about 2070 it will not. But we don't trust these models. As a matter of fact, just yesterday a paper has appeared in I think an important paper because Science Advances saying that the model's ability to predict sea ice is not good. Okay, so that I have to study more detail. So although this is what Marsh is saying, that the sea ice will disappear only in the next century, but one should be ready for a surprise that it may happen even here. Okay? Now, how is the model doing with respect to zonal mean temperature? That is not bad. Here, black is the observation, and the various colors are various models. And you can see that both in the tropics and in northern latitude, most of the models are close to observation, but in the southern latitude, we have problem. Southern latitude, we have problem because one, we don't have too much data. Secondly, we don't know much about Antarctica. Antarctica is a very difficult continent to make observations in. It is 6 months of darkness, 6 months of sunlight. So only a few countries have managed to put up stations there, including India. So we don't have enough data there, and so models have some problems in that domain. Now this showing outgoing longer radiation from all the models as a function of latitude compared to observation in black. You can see most models are over predicting the outgoing radiation. Okay, that means some problem with clouds or water vapor, something is there which makes them radiate too much. Okay? But if you look at the total cloud amount, models are doing very badly. Total cloud amount of observation, let's say at the equator, is around 65%. Models are getting all the way from 20 to 90. Okay, so and in some regions like southern hemisphere, the errors are even more. So cloudiness is the biggest error in the model. Okay? This is not bad. Outgoing longer radiation is, at least some models are getting it correct, but cloudiness is terrible. Now, here's one more example of various simulations that have been done in the last 20 years. It's similar to what I showed earlier, so I will not spend too much time on it. You can look at it in leisure. And now, this is the old figure I showed you. Because of all these problems with cloudiness and OLR and ice and cloud, models show a range of temperatures due to doubling of CO2. Okay? This we discussed in the first lecture. Now, these are the people who organized a coupled model project in which GFDL, where Manabe works, was a prominent role they played, and also NCAR, of course. Now, what do these coupled models show? When you compare average of 42 models, you see that models have a large, in summer, June, July, August, they have a large bias in sea surface temperature. How much? Around 2 degrees. So most models are about 2 degrees colder in the Pacific Ocean. Okay, that's not a good news. And again, along all the coasts you see, there are problems. African coast, North American coast, South American and South African coast. So all these problems, right? And these are the new model, the old model. So from the old to the new, CMIP 3 is the old simulation. 5 is more recent. Now there is 6 coming up. There is not much improvement. So this is the bad news, that in spite of all the research and all the people who have done research on it for the last 25 years, the bias, cold bias, is not improving. It is still persisting in certain places. Okay. Around India is not bad. Around India things are looking quite good, except maybe the east coast of Africa. But over Pacific, which is a large ocean, very important ocean, the bias is very large. Okay. Now, what is it? Sorry, that is the same. This is annual mean or seasonal mean. Okay. Now I want to explain take two models from the CMIP simulation. One is the Japanese model MIROC, other is NCAR, the American model, and how they respond to an increase of carbon dioxide of 1% till it doubles. Okay. You can see that the Japanese model shows a 3-degree warming. The NCAR shows 1-degree warming. Okay. Big difference. Why is this so? You can see clearly, go to the bottom figure here. You see that the cloudiness in the NCAR model slightly increased. In the Japanese model, it decreased. When cloudiness decreases, more radiation is absorbed by the Earth, and so the temperature goes up. Okay, so that is the main difference between two models. One model says the next 100 years clouds will go down by about 2%. The other model says the clouds increase by about 0.5%. So you must understand how sensitive the global climate is to a small change in cloudiness. 1 or 2% change in cloudiness gives you a large error. So you might ask, there have been now 50 years of satellite data which shows how much is the cloudiness. How come we are not getting it right? The answer is, today both the satellite data as well as model have errors. Now you might ask, why should satellite have errors? Satellite is watching the Earth continuously, right? But that is true only in the tropics. In the tropics we have geostationary satellites which observe the tropical region every 15 minutes. So it will not miss any cloud. But if you go beyond about 60 north and 60 south, there are no satellites which are looking at it continuously. There are polar orbiting satellites which will visit that area about twice a day. Twice a day is not enough. If you look at a place once every 12 hours, you will miss many clouds. Because clouds have a lifetime of 1 hour typically. So if you visit only, let's say 8 a.m., 8 p.m. and the cloud came at 2 p.m., you will not see it. So the estimate of total mean cloudiness from a satellite has an error bar about 5%. Okay. So we cannot tune the model to get the right cloudiness because we don't know what is the correct cloudiness. So this is why models show huge range of cloudiness and the response to CO2 increase. I hope you understand this important limitation of climate model. Yeah, you're right, Prashant. Over the pole, polar satellites do go more often, but not often enough to sample that region every hour. See, we want to get the clouds right. You must have at least 24 samples per day. You are not getting that all the time, okay? And remember that when there is a polar winter, you don't get any data in the visible regional spectrum. You are only depend on infrared, okay? So those are the complicated polar regions. 6 months of night, 6 months of day. So when there is day, you get lots of data in the solar and infrared. When at night, you get only infrared data. So there are complications with that, okay? Again, I want to highlight that observed total mean cloudiness from satellite over ocean, which is easier than over land. You can see that the model is on the right, multi-model mean, multi-model ensemble. You can see that over the equator, satellite says 25%. Model says about 40%. Huge error, okay? This is total cloud. Now we come to low cloud, which are very important in determining Earth's albedo. In low cloud, The satellite says in the in the region around 30 north, 30 south, it's about 40%. But the model mean says it's more like 10%. This is a huge error. And until this is fixed, you will not get the global mean albedo correctly. Okay. So you've got a huge error in the tropics in the low cloud. Okay. Compared to observation. So remember that there's a huge error there which has not been fixed yet. Now let's look at high cloud. High cloud is even worse. High cloud is better. High cloud, you can see annual mean is 21.7% observation, model is 20.8%, and spatial distribution also is quite good. And this is then cloud radius effect. This is just the effect of cloud. That is also similar. So what message is? High cloud are better simulated than low cloud. So that's the message I want you to remember, that the models are better at simulating high clouds than low clouds. Okay, I would like to now stop here for a short break. So before that, I want to know whether any of you have any doubts. Any questions on this part? Yeah, let me see. Can you hear me? Because sound quality is poor here. Can you hear me or not?
You are clear, sir.
Okay. So one question Shreyasi Paul has asked is, if you want to do artificial cloud seeding to reduce aerosol from atmosphere, is it possible? Yes, you can put various things in the model. People have played around because we want to understand the aerosol cloud interaction. So people have put particles in the model to see how the clouds change. But remember that first you need high quality observation over various regions to understand how aerosols affect clouds. That you don't have enough. You have got some good data in the last 10 years, but not enough. Especially over oceans. Over oceans, we need to go out in ships and put aerosol and see how clouds behave. Okay? There we are not done too well. Okay? And so that's where our lacuna lies. That's why I'm very concerned about plans to do geoengineering. All of geoengineering is an attempt to cool the earth by putting some particles in the atmosphere, okay, so that reflects the sun's radiation. Now, that is something I would say, okay, if we understood how aerosol influence clouds. We don't have full understanding. So to go on a large-scale experiment to alter the climate of the Earth without fully understanding is not very smart. So I would say that it is not desirable, because even today the role of aerosol in our climate is not good. Okay? It is still poor. Okay, are there any other questions? Otherwise, we'll take
sir. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll take a 15-minute break. We'll come back at 11:15. Okay.
Okay, sir.
No, not right now. Not at this point. Only just off and on.